My name is Casey. I'm a park ranger in a remote stretch of Oregon forest. When I took this job, I thought I'd be spending my days hiking, watching wildlife, and breathing in the peace and quiet. I never imagined I'd end up living a story I'd be too scared to tell around a campfire. The ranger station at Pine Hollow is about as far from civilization as you can get. The nearest town is a 40-minute drive down a winding, bumpy road. There's no cell service. The only way to reach the outside world is with an old radio that works when it feels like it. Most days, it's just me, the trees, and the endless quiet. I arrived on a gray September afternoon. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the air smelled like rain and pine needles. The station itself is a log cabin, small, sturdy, and old. The porch creaks when you step on it. The windows are always a little foggy, and moss grows thick on the roof. It's cozy in its own way. Tom, the old ranger, was waiting for me on the porch. He was tall and thin, with a gray beard and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. He didn't smile when he shook my hand. "You're early," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel. "That's good. Gives us time to talk." He led me inside. The station was simple. There was a desk, a couple of chairs, a bunk in the corner, and shelves lined with maps and old field guides. There was a wood stove for heat and a kettle whistling on top. Tom poured us both a cup of coffee and sat down across from me. "You ever worked a place like this before?" he asked. I shook my head. "Closest I've come was a summer job at a state park. Nothing this remote." Tom nodded, almost like he'd expected that answer. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a battered, spiral-bound notebook. The cover was stained, and the corners were bent. "You'll want to read this before your first night," he said, sliding it across the table. "It's the rules. Follow them, and you'll be fine." I picked up the notebook and flipped it open. The first page was written in neat, blocky letters. Rules for surviving the night shift at Pine Hollow Forest. I laughed, thinking it was a joke. Tom didn't laugh. He leaned forward, his eyes serious. "I'm not kidding, Casey. These rules are the only thing standing between you and, well, let's just say the forest has a mind of its own." I looked back at the notebook. The rules were strange. Some were practical, but others made no sense at all. Rule 1. Never leave the station after sunset unless it's an emergency. Rule 2. If you hear footsteps on the roof, do not investigate. Rule 3. At 2:13 a.m., check the radio. If you hear static, ignore it. If you hear a voice, turn the radio off, and don't turn it back on until sunrise. Rule 4. If you see lights moving between the trees, lock all doors and windows. Do not look outside until the lights are gone. Rule 5. If a deer stands at the edge of the clearing and stares at you, do not acknowledge it. Rule 6. If you find muddy footprints inside the station, sweep them away immediately and sprinkle salt on the floor. Rule 7. At exactly 3:33 a.m., make sure the front porch light is on. If the bulb is burned out, replace it, no matter what you hear outside. Rule 8. Never answer a knock at the door after midnight. There were more, each one stranger than the last. Some had notes scribbled beside them in different handwriting. Don't trust the voice that sounds like your mother. If you find an extra key on your belt, throw it into the river. If you wake up outside, don't go back inside until sunrise. I looked up at Tom. "Is this some kind of hazing thing?" He shook his head. "I wish it was. You'll see. Just follow the rules. Don't try to be a hero." He stood up and grabbed his coat. "I'll be gone by sundown. My truck's packed. You've got the place to yourself tonight." I watched him walk out to his truck, feeling a strange sense of unease. He looked back once, his face pale in the fading light. "Lock the doors, Casey, and whatever you do, don't invite anything in." Then he was gone, leaving me alone in the station. I spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking my things and exploring the cabin. There was a small kitchen, a bathroom with a rusty shower, and a radio set up by the window. I tried the radio, but all I got was static. I made myself some dinner, canned soup and crackers, and sat on the porch as the sun went down. The forest was beautiful in the golden light, but as the shadows grew longer, I felt a chill settle over the clearing. When darkness finally fell, I locked every door and window, just like the rules said. I checked the porch light. It worked for now. I swept the floor, just in case, and sprinkled a little salt by the door. It felt silly, but I did it anyway. The first few hours of my shift were quiet. I read through the notebook again, trying to memorize the rules. I wondered who had written them. Some pages were old and faded. Others looked newer, as if new rules were added over the years. Around midnight, I heard something moving outside. Not an animal, something heavier. I froze, listening. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest. I remembered the rule: never answer a knock at the door after midnight. I waited, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. For a long moment, there was silence. Then 3 slow knocks. I didn't move, I didn't speak. I just sat there, gripping the notebook, staring at the door. The knocks came again, louder this time. I squeezed my eyes shut and counted to 10. When I opened them, the knocking had stopped. The only sound was the wind in the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. When the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I finally let myself breathe. I'd survived my first night at Pine Hollow, but I knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The rules were real, and I was going to have to follow them if I wanted to survive. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the windows. The world outside was gray and misty, the trees shrouded in fog. I made coffee and tried to shake off the memories of the night before. The knocks at the door, the heavy footsteps circling the cabin. They felt like a bad dream. But when I saw the notebook still clutched in my hand, I knew it was all real. I spent the morning getting used to my new home. I checked the generator, made sure the wood stove had enough fuel, and walked the perimeter of the clearing. The forest felt ancient, the trees towering overhead, their branches tangled together like giant fingers. Moss dripped from every limb, and the ground was soft and spongy beneath my boots. As I walked, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something watching me from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the steady drip of rain and the distant call of a raven. By noon, the rain had stopped, and a weak sun filtered through the clouds. I radioed into headquarters, letting them know I'd survived my first night. The voice on the other end was crackly and distant, but friendly enough. "You'll get used to it out there," the dispatcher said. "Just remember to keep your wits about you." I spent the rest of the day exploring the trails around the station. The forest was beautiful, full of ferns and wildflowers, with little streams winding through the undergrowth. I spotted deer tracks in the mud, and once I caught a glimpse of a fox darting through the trees. For a while, I almost forgot about the rules. But as the sun began to set, the feeling of unease crept back in. The shadows grew longer, and the forest seemed to close in around me. I hurried back to the station, locking the door behind me as soon as I stepped inside. I made dinner and sat at the desk, reading through the notebook again. The rules still seemed ridiculous, but after last night, I wasn't about to ignore them. I checked the porch light, swept the floor, and sprinkled salt by the door, just in case. As darkness fell, the forest outside turned pitch black. The only light came from the lamp on my desk and the faint glow of the porch bulb. I tried to distract myself by reading, but every little sound made me jump. Around 10 o'clock, I heard something on the roof. At first, I thought it was just a branch or maybe a raccoon. But then I remembered the second rule. If you hear footsteps on the roof, do not investigate. The footsteps were slow and heavy, moving from one end of the roof to the other. They stopped above the porch, then started up again, circling the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to look outside, to see what was making the noise, but I forced myself to stay put. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, then stopped as suddenly as they'd started. The silence that followed was even worse. I tried to go back to my book, but my mind kept drifting. What could be walking on the roof? A bear? Something else? Just after midnight, I heard a new sound, a soft tapping at the window. I froze, notebook in hand. The tapping was slow and rhythmic, almost like someone was drumming their fingers on the glass. I remembered the rule about knocks at the door. There was nothing about windows. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the window, waiting for the tapping to stop. After a few minutes, it did. The silence returned, thick and heavy. I let out a shaky breath and tried to relax. Maybe it was just a tree branch in the wind. Maybe I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But then, I saw something at the edge of the clearing. A deer. It stood perfectly still, just beyond the reach of the porch light. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, reflecting the light like two tiny moons. It didn't move. It didn't blink. Just stared at me. I remembered the rule. If a deer stands at the edge of the clearing and stares at you, do not acknowledge it. I forced myself to look away, pretending not to see it, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. Minutes passed. The deer didn't move. I tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Eventually, I glanced out the window again. The deer was gone. I let out a sigh of relief and leaned back in my chair. The rest of the night was quiet, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness. When dawn finally came, I stumbled outside, bleary-eyed and exhausted. The clearing was empty. There were no tracks, no sign that the deer or anything else had been there. I checked the roof, half expecting to find claw marks or footprints, but there was nothing, just moss and a few scattered pine needles. I went back inside and made coffee, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But when I picked up the notebook, I noticed something new. A fresh line had been added to the rules, written in shaky handwriting. If the deer comes closer, hide. My hands trembled as I read it. I hadn't written that. I was sure of it. I looked around the cabin, suddenly feeling very alone. The forest was trying to warn me, or maybe it was trying to test me. Either way, I knew one thing for sure. The rules were real, and if I wanted to survive another night, I'd have to follow them, no matter how strange they got. The third day in Pine Hollow started out calm. The sun finally broke through the clouds, sending golden beams across the clearing and making the moss on the trees glow. For a few hours, I almost forgot about the rules, the footsteps on the roof, and the deer's glowing eyes. I spent the morning clearing fallen branches from the trails and checking the old wooden signs that marked the park boundaries. I tried to convince myself that everything was normal, that I was just letting the isolation and the old ranger's warnings get to me. But every time I glanced at the battered notebook, sitting on the desk like a silent threat, I felt that old unease creep back in. Around noon, I found a set of muddy footprints near the back porch. They were small, too small for an adult, but too big for any animal I knew. They led from the edge of the forest right up to the cabin's back step, then vanished. I swept them away and sprinkled salt on the boards, just like the rules said. As I did, I caught myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching from the trees. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. I tried the radio again, but all I got was static. I read through the logbooks left by previous rangers, searching for answers. Most entries were boring: weather reports, trail maintenance, the occasional lost hiker. But every now and then, I'd find a line that made my skin crawl. Heard singing in the woods. No one found. Lights between the trees again. Locked doors. Waited it out. Do not trust the deer. I closed the logbook and stared out the window. The forest was so quiet. It felt like the trees themselves were holding their breath. That night, I made sure to follow every rule. I locked all the doors and windows, checked the porch light, swept the floor, and sprinkled salt by the entrance. I even double-checked the batteries in my flashlight, just in case. As the sun set, the forest changed. The air grew colder, and the shadows stretched across the clearing like long, dark fingers. I sat at the desk, notebook open, and tried to distract myself with a deck of cards. But every little sound made me jump. Around 11:30, I noticed a faint glow outside. At first, I thought it was the moon, but when I looked closer, I saw lights moving between the trees. They were soft and white, like lanterns floating through the woods. Sometimes they hovered in place. Sometimes they darted behind the trunks, weaving in and out of the shadows. There were 3 at first, then 4, then more. Dozens of glowing orbs dancing through the forest. I remembered the rule: if you see lights moving between the trees, lock all doors and windows. Do not look outside until the lights are gone. My heart pounded as I checked every lock again. I pulled the curtains closed, but I couldn't help peeking through a tiny gap. The lights were getting closer, moving in slow, swirling patterns. They didn't seem threatening at first, just strange and beautiful. But then I saw something else. A figure stood among the lights. It was tall and thin, almost blending in with the trees. Its face was pale and blank, with eyes that glowed like the orbs floating around it. It didn't move. It just watched the cabin. I pulled away from the window, heart racing. I sat on the floor, back against the wall, and tried to steady my breathing. I wanted to turn on the radio to call for help, but I remembered the rule about the radio and the voice that might answer. The lights circled the clearing, swirling faster and faster. The figure moved with them, sometimes vanishing behind a tree, sometimes reappearing closer to the cabin. I heard a faint humming, like a lullaby sung through water. I closed my eyes and tried to block out the sound. I counted the seconds, then the minutes. The humming grew louder, filling the cabin, vibrating in my bones. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, the lights began to fade. One by one, they blinked out, swallowed by the darkness. The humming stopped. The forest was silent again. I waited a long time before I dared to look outside. The clearing was empty. The only light came from the porch bulb, flickering in the wind. I slumped against the wall, exhausted. My hands were shaking. I wrote everything down in the logbook, every detail I could remember. The lights, the figure, the humming. I didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but it made me feel a little less alone. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those lights weaving through the trees. I saw the figure's glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness. At dawn, I stumbled outside. The forest looked normal again, peaceful even. There was no sign of the lights, no footprints in the clearing, just the sound of birds and the rustle of leaves. But when I checked the salt by the door, I found a single dark footprint in the middle of the white grains. It was shaped like a human foot, but longer, with too many toes. I swept it away, heart pounding, and added more salt. Back inside, I found a new line in the notebook, written in the same shaky handwriting as before. If the lights stop at your window, do not let them in. I stared at the words, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. The rules were changing. The forest was watching me, testing me, and I was starting to wonder if I'd make it through another night. The forest was quiet the next morning, almost too quiet. Sunlight filtered through the trees, but it didn't feel warm. I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. Every muscle in my body ached, and my mind kept replaying the lights in the trees, the pale figure, and that single, strange footprint in the salt. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the shadows, maybe an animal I'd never seen before, but deep down, I knew better. I made coffee and sat on the porch, staring out at the woods. The air was still, and the only sound was the distant call of a raven. I tried to focus on the normal ranger tasks, checking the generator, logging the weather, making sure the firewood was stacked. But every time I glanced at the edge of the clearing, I expected to see those lights again. Or worse, the deer standing perfectly still, watching me with those unblinking eyes. By midday, I was restless. I decided to hike one of the shorter trails, hoping the movement would clear my head. The forest was beautiful in the sunlight, with ferns and wildflowers lining the path, and the scent of pine thick in the air. For a while, I almost forgot about the rules. But as I walked, I found myself listening for footsteps behind me. Once I thought I heard something moving through the underbrush, but when I turned, there was nothing, just the wind rustling the leaves. I made it back to the station before sunset, just as the sky was turning pink and gold. I locked the doors and windows, checked the porch light, and swept the floor. I sprinkled a fresh line of salt by the door, just like the notebook said. I even checked the batteries in my flashlight twice. The first few hours of the night were uneventful. I read old ranger logs, played solitaire, and tried not to think about what might be waiting outside. But as midnight approached, the air in the cabin grew colder. The silence pressed in on me, heavy and thick. At 2:13 a.m., I remembered the rule about the radio. I almost ignored it, thinking it was just another weird superstition. But something made me get up and walk over to the old set by the window. I turned the dial. At first, there was nothing but static. I was about to turn it off when the static faded, and I heard a voice. It was soft at first, barely more than a whisper, but as I listened, it grew louder, clearer. It sounded like my mother. "Casey, are you there? Casey, please answer me." My heart stopped. I hadn't heard my mother's voice in years, not since she passed away. For a moment, I almost answered. My hand hovered over the radio, ready to press the button. But then I remembered the note in the rules. Don't trust the voice that sounds like your mother. My breath caught in my throat. The voice kept calling my name, pleading, begging me to answer. It sounded so real, so desperate. I squeezed my eyes shut and turned the radio off, my hands shaking. For a long time, I just stood there, listening to the silence. I was sure I'd hear the voice again, but the cabin was quiet. The only sound was the wind outside, and my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. I sat back down at the desk, notebook in hand. I wrote down everything I'd heard, trying to make sense of it. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or was something really out there, using my mother's voice to lure me in? I thought about the other rules, about the deer, the lights, the muddy footprints. Every warning in the notebook had turned out to be true. I couldn't risk ignoring this one. Suddenly, I heard a soft scraping sound from the back door. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my flashlight and crept over, careful not to make a sound. There on the floor were fresh, muddy footprints. They led from the door to the middle of the room, then vanished. I swept them away quickly and sprinkled more salt, my hands trembling. As I finished, I heard a faint tapping at the window. I turned off the lamp and crouched in the shadows, heart pounding. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, but I didn't move. I waited, counting the seconds, until it finally stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I stumbled outside, blinking in the pale light. The clearing was empty. The woods were silent, but the fear lingered. I knew now that the forest was testing me, trying to find a way in. The rules weren't just for my safety. They were the only thing keeping whatever was out there at bay. I checked the notebook again. Another line had been added, the handwriting shaky and rushed. If the voice calls you by your childhood nickname, leave the radio off for the rest of the night. I stared at the words, my hands cold and clammy. I hadn't told anyone my childhood nickname, not even Tom, the old ranger. And yet, the forest knew. That day, I kept busy. I cleaned the cabin, chopped wood, and walked the perimeter twice. But every time I passed the radio, I felt its presence, like it was waiting for me to slip up, to answer the wrong call. That night, I followed the rules even more carefully. I locked every door and window, checked the porch light, and swept the floor twice. I sat by the stove, notebook in hand, and waited. The forest was quiet, but I knew it was watching. And as the hours ticked by, I realized something terrifying. The rules were changing. The forest was learning, and it was only a matter of time before it found a new way in. I woke up to a heavy fog pressing against the cabin windows. The world outside was gray and silent, the trees barely more than shadows. I felt like I hadn't slept at all. My dreams were full of voices on the radio and lights weaving between the trees. Even in sleep, the rules haunted me. I tried to shake it off. I made coffee, swept the floor, and checked the salt by the door. No footprints this morning. That was a small relief, but it didn't last long. As I sat on the porch, sipping my coffee, I noticed something odd at the edge of the clearing. A single, muddy boot print. It was fresh, too, still wet and sharp in the morning dew. I scanned the tree line, but saw nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the endless, silent forest. I went inside, grabbed the notebook, and added a new entry. Found a single boot print. Not mine. No sign of anyone nearby. The day passed slowly. I kept busy with chores, but my mind kept drifting back to that boot print. Was someone out there watching me, or was it something else? By late afternoon, the fog had lifted, but a strange tension hung in the air. I was restocking the firewood when the radio crackled to life. At first, it was just static, but then a voice broke through. "Ranger, this is HQ. We've got a report of a missing hiker, last seen near your sector. Name's Ben Carter, mid-30s, blue jacket. Keep an eye out." My stomach tightened. I remembered the rules. Never leave the station after sunset unless it's an emergency, but this felt like an emergency. I radioed back. Copy that. I'll check the trails before dark. I packed my gear, flashlight, first aid kit, extra batteries, and the notebook. I left a note on the desk, just in case. As I stepped outside, the sun was already dipping behind the trees, turning the sky a deep orange. I started down the main trail, calling out Ben's name every few minutes. The woods were quiet, too quiet. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the damp earth. About a mile in, I found a blue wool cap snagged on a branch. I picked it up, heart pounding. Ben! Ben Carter! Can you hear me? No answer, just the echo of my own voice. I pressed on, following the trail deeper into the forest. The light faded fast, shadows stretching between the trees. I checked my watch. Sunset was less than an hour away. That's when I heard it, a faint cry for help coming from off the trail. I hesitated. The rules were clear. Never leave the station after sunset. But I couldn't ignore someone in trouble. I left the path, pushing through thick underbrush. The cry came again, closer this time. Help! Please, I'm over here! I stumbled into a small clearing. There, slumped against a fallen log, was a man in a blue jacket. He looked up as I approached, his face pale and streaked with dirt. Ben? I asked. He nodded weakly. I twisted my ankle. I can't walk. I knelt beside him, checking his injury. It was swollen, but not broken. I helped him to his feet, slinging his arm over my shoulder. We need to get back to the station before dark, I said. We moved slowly, Ben limping heavily. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees pressing closer with every step. The air grew colder, and I felt eyes watching us from the shadows. Halfway back, the sun disappeared behind the hills. The woods turned black, and the path was swallowed by darkness. My flashlight barely cut through the gloom. That's when I heard footsteps behind us. Soft, shuffling, but definitely there. I spun around, shining my light into the trees. Nothing, just the endless, silent forest. We kept moving, faster now. The footsteps followed, never getting closer, but never falling behind. Did you hear that? Ben whispered. I nodded. Don't look back, just keep moving. We reached the edge of the clearing, the cabin's porch light a faint glow in the distance. Relief washed over me, but as we stepped into the clearing, Ben stopped. Wait, he said, his voice trembling. There's something out there. I turned, shining my light behind us. At the edge of the trees, a deer stood perfectly still, its eyes glowing in the beam. It was joined by another, then another, until a half-dozen deer stood in a silent line watching us. I remembered the rule. If a deer stands at the edge of the clearing and stares at you, do not acknowledge it. I grabbed Ben's arm and pulled him toward the cabin. Don't look at them. Just keep moving. We reached the porch, and I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the door open. We stumbled inside, slamming the door behind us. I locked every bolt, checked the windows, and turned on every light. Ben collapsed onto the couch, breathing hard. What the hell was that? He whispered. I shook my head. Just don't ask. We're safe in here. The rest of the night was tense. Ben kept glancing at the windows, flinching at every sound. I handed him a blanket and some water, then sat at the desk, notebook open. I wrote down everything that had happened. The boot print, the voice on the radio, the deer in the clearing. Around midnight, Ben fell asleep. I stayed awake, listening to the wind and the creaks of the old cabin. At 2:13 a.m., the radio crackled again. This time, I didn't answer. When dawn finally came, I checked outside. The deer were gone. The clearing was empty, but something had changed. I could feel it in the air, in the way the trees seemed to lean closer, listening. I knew I'd broken a rule. I'd left the station after sunset, even if it was to help someone. The forest had noticed, and I had a feeling it was only going to get worse from here. When the sun rose, I was still wide awake. Ben, the hiker I'd rescued, was sleeping on the couch, his breathing slow and steady. I watched him for a while, trying to convince myself he was just a normal guy who'd gotten lost. But something about him didn't feel right. Maybe it was the way he'd stared at the deer the night before, or the way he'd flinched at every sound, even after we were safe inside. I made coffee and sat at the table, notebook open. I wrote down everything from the night before. The boot print, the deer, the footsteps in the woods. I added a new line to the rules. If you rescue someone after dark, watch them closely. Ben woke up just after sunrise. He looked pale and tired, his eyes ringed with dark circles. He sat up slowly, wincing as he moved his ankle. "Thanks for helping me," he said, his voice hoarse. "I don't remember much after I twisted my ankle. Just running, then falling. I thought I heard someone calling my name from the trees." I nodded. "You were lucky I found you." He looked at me, his eyes searching my face. "Did you see them? The deer?" I hesitated. "Yeah, they're always around here at night." He shivered. "They weren't normal. I know it sounds crazy, but I felt like they were waiting for something, watching me." I didn't answer. I just poured him a cup of coffee and slid it across the table. He drank in silence, staring out the window. The forest was bright and peaceful in the morning sun, but I could still feel the tension in the air. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. After breakfast, I checked Ben's ankle. It was still swollen, but he could put weight on it. I offered to drive him to the ranger station in town, but he shook his head. "I'll be fine," he said. "I just need to rest a bit. Maybe I'll head out after lunch." I didn't argue. I figured he could use some time to recover, and honestly, I wanted to keep an eye on him a little longer. We spent the morning in uneasy silence. I did my usual chores, always glancing over at Ben. Sometimes I caught him staring at the notebook, his expression unreadable. At noon, I made sandwiches. Ben barely touched his food. He kept looking at the window, flinching every time a shadow moved outside. Finally, he spoke. "Can I tell you something? Something weird happened to me out there." I nodded, trying to sound calm. "Go ahead." He took a deep breath. "After I twisted my ankle, I tried to crawl back to the trail, but I got turned around. I kept hearing someone calling my name, but it wasn't you. It sounded like my sister, but she's been dead for years." A chill ran down my spine. I remembered the rule about the voice on the radio, the one that sounded like my mother. Ben went on. "I followed the voice for a while. It led me deeper into the woods. I saw lights too, floating between the trees. At first I thought they were other hikers, but they moved too fast. Then I saw the deer. They were standing in a circle, all staring at me. I tried to go around them, but every time I moved, they moved with me." He looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, you were there helping me up." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him about the rules, about the things I'd seen, but I wasn't sure he'd believe me. I wasn't even sure I believed myself. Ben stood up, limping to the window. "I should go. I don't want to stay here another night." I nodded. "I'll walk you to the trailhead." He packed his things quickly, barely saying a word. As we stepped outside, I noticed the deer tracks in the mud, fresh, circling the cabin. I tried not to let Ben see my worry. We walked in silence to the edge of the clearing. Ben paused, looking back at the cabin. "Be careful," he said quietly. "There's something wrong with this place." I watched him disappear down the trail, his figure swallowed by the trees. When I got back to the cabin, I found something strange on the porch. An old, rusty key. It hadn't been there before. I picked it up, remembering the note in the rules. If you find an extra key on your belt, throw it into the river. I didn't know where this key had come from, but I didn't want to take any chances. I walked down to the river at the edge of the clearing and tossed the key into the rushing water. It vanished instantly, swallowed by the current. Back at the cabin, I sat down and tried to calm myself. The air felt heavier, the shadows deeper. I checked the notebook. Another line had been added, the handwriting shaky and new. "If you bring someone back after dark, make sure they leave before sunset the next day." I stared at the words, my mind racing. Was Ben safe now? Or had I put him in even more danger by helping him? That night, I followed the rules more carefully than ever. I locked every door and window, checked the porch light 3 times, and swept the floor until it was spotless. I sprinkled extra salt by every entrance, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ben lost in the woods, the deer circling him, the lights weaving through the trees. I wondered if he'd make it out, or if he'd become another secret the forest kept. As the night dragged on, I heard footsteps outside, soft, slow, circling the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't look out the window. I just gripped the notebook and waited for dawn. When the first light finally crept through the trees, I let out a shaky breath. I was still alive, but I knew the forest was watching, waiting for me to slip up, and I knew, deep down, that the rules were the only thing keeping me safe. That morning, the air felt heavier than ever. I woke up to a sky thick with clouds, the forest dim and silent. Even the birds seemed to know something was wrong. I moved through my routine, coffee, sweeping, checking the salt, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I kept thinking about Ben and the things he'd said, the voice calling his name, the lights, the deer circling him. I wondered if he'd made it out, or if the forest had claimed him after all. I wanted to radio HQ and ask if he'd checked in, but I hesitated. What would I even say? That the woods were haunted, that there were rules you had to follow or something would come for you in the night. By noon, I was restless. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The forest was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I found more deer tracks near the edge of the clearing, fresh and deep, circling the cabin. I followed them for a few yards, but they disappeared into the moss and undergrowth. I went back inside and checked the notebook. The last line was still there. If you bring someone back after dark, make sure they leave before sunset the next day. I wondered if there would be a new rule soon. It seemed like the forest was always one step ahead, always changing the game. The afternoon dragged on. I tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. The shadows outside grew longer, stretching across the clearing like dark fingers. I checked the porch light, swept the floor again, and added another thick line of salt by the door. As the sun began to set, I felt the tension in the air tighten. I made a quick dinner but barely touched it. My stomach was in knots. I sat at the desk, notebook open, and waited for night to fall. It started with a single deer. I noticed it just after dusk, standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the shadows. Its eyes glowed in the fading light, fixed on the cabin. I remembered the rule. If a deer stands at the edge of the clearing and stares at you, do not acknowledge it. I looked away, pretending not to see it, but when I glanced back a few minutes later, there were 2 deer, then 3, then 5. They stood in silent line, all facing the cabin, their eyes reflecting the porch light like tiny lanterns. I tried to ignore them, but it was impossible. Every time I looked up, there were more, 10, 12, a whole herd, silent and still, watching me from the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest. I remembered what Ben had said, the deer moving with him, circling him, waiting. I wondered what they were waiting for now. Suddenly, the porch light flickered and went out. My breath caught in my throat. I checked my watch. 3:32 a.m. The rule flashed in my mind. At exactly 3:33 a.m., make sure the front porch light is on. If the bulb has burned out, replace it, no matter what you hear outside. I grabbed a fresh bulb from the drawer and my flashlight, hands shaking. I stared at the door, trying to work up the courage to go outside. The rules were clear. I had to do it, no matter what. I unlocked the door and stepped onto the porch. The air was icy cold, and the silence was suffocating. My flashlight beam danced across the clearing, catching the eyes of the deer. They didn't move. They just watched. I forced myself to the edge of the porch, unscrewed the dead bulb, and fumbled the new one into place. The deer didn't move, but I could feel their eyes on me, hundreds of them, burning holes in my back. As soon as I flipped the switch, the light snapped on, flooding the porch with harsh yellow glow. The deer blinked in unison. Then, one by one, they turned and melted back into the trees. I stumbled back inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the notebook. I wrote down everything. How many deer, how they watched, how they disappeared the moment the light came on. I sat at the desk, listening to the quiet, but the quiet didn't last. A soft tapping started at the window. I froze, remembering the rule about knocks at the door, but there was nothing about windows. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I didn't move. I didn't look. Then, a voice, soft, almost a whisper, came from just outside the glass. "Casey, let us in." I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the notebook so hard my knuckles turned white. The voice grew louder, more urgent. "Casey, we're cold. Let us in." I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just waited, counting the seconds, willing the sun to rise. Eventually, the tapping stopped. The voice faded. The silence returned. When dawn finally broke, I stumbled outside, blinking in the pale light. The clearing was empty. No deer, no footprints. Nothing but the cold morning air. I checked the notebook. A new line had been added, the handwriting even shakier than before. "If the deer come to the porch, do not open the door." I stared at the words, my heart pounding. The rules were changing again. The forest was getting bolder, and I knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before something tried to come inside. The day after the deer surrounded my cabin, I barely slept. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the silent herd, the dead porch light, the way their eyes followed my every move. I checked the notebook again and again, reading the new rule. "If the deer come to the porch, do not open the door." It felt like the forest was closing in, testing my resolve, waiting for me to slip up. I went through my routine with extra care. I swept the floor, replaced the salt, checked every lock twice. I even made sure the backup bulbs for the porch light were lined up and ready. The sky was overcast, and the wind carried the scent of rain and earth. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching me again. By late afternoon, the air felt charged, like the woods were holding their breath. I tried to distract myself by reading old ranger logs, but I couldn't focus. Every few minutes I'd look up, convinced I'd heard footsteps or a whisper from the trees. As dusk settled, the tension grew. I made a quick dinner and sat at the desk, notebook open, flashlight and extra batteries within reach. I checked the porch light again and again, watching it flicker in the wind. The forest outside was silent. No birds, no insects, just the hush of something waiting. The silence was broken by a soft, deliberate knock at the door. My heart stopped. I remembered the rule. Never answer a knock at the door after midnight. The knocking came again, louder this time. I sat frozen, staring at the door, notebook clenched in my hands. Whoever, or whatever, was out there knew I was inside. Then, I heard a voice. It was soft, almost pleading. "Casey, please let me in. It's cold out here." It sounded like Ben, the hiker I'd rescued. My stomach twisted. I knew Ben had left, had watched him disappear down the trail, but the voice was perfect. Same tone, same desperation. I squeezed my eyes shut and shook my head. "You're not Ben," I whispered. The voice changed, becoming higher, softer. "Casey, it's Mom. Please, honey, I need your help." I felt tears sting my eyes. My mother had been gone for years. I remembered the rule, don't trust the voice that sounds like your mother. The knocking grew frantic, then stopped. Silence crept back in, heavy and suffocating. I tried to steady my breathing, but then I heard something even worse. A scraping sound at the back window. I turned off every light and crouched in the shadows, barely daring to breathe. The scraping moved from window to window, circling the cabin. I caught a glimpse of movement outside, a pale face, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It pressed against the glass, lips moving in a silent plea. I remembered the rule about the lights. If the lights stop at your window, do not let them in. I stayed perfectly still. The face lingered, then vanished. That's when the porch light flickered and died. Again, right at 3:33 a.m., I grabbed a new bulb and my flashlight, forcing myself to the door. My hands shook as I unlocked it and stepped onto the porch. The air was colder than before, and the woods were alive with whispers. As I reached up to change the bulb, I heard footsteps behind me, soft, shuffling, getting closer. I didn't turn around. I focused on the light, screwing in the new bulb as fast as I could. The moment it clicked on, the footsteps stopped. I turned slowly. The clearing was full of deer, more than before, their eyes glowing in the harsh light. They stood perfectly still, watching me, as if waiting for me to make a mistake. I backed into the cabin, locking the door behind me. My heart hammered in my chest. I checked every window, every lock, then sat on the floor, notebook open in my lap. That's when I heard it, a soft, insistent scratching at the back door. It grew louder, more desperate, until it sounded like claws raking the wood. I remembered the salt. I grabbed the container and poured a thick line across the threshold. The scratching stopped instantly. I slumped against the wall, exhausted. The forest was relentless, always testing, always pushing. As dawn finally broke, I stumbled outside. The deer were gone. The clearing was empty, but the ground was covered in muddy, human-shaped footprints. Too many toes, too long, circling the cabin in tight rings. I swept them away and added more salt, hands shaking. Inside, I found a new line in the notebook, written in hurried, uneven script. If something breaches the salt line, do not stay in the cabin. Grab the notebook and run to the river. Don't look back. I stared at the words, fear crawling up my spine. The forest was getting bolder. The rules were changing faster now, adapting to my every move. I knew the next night would be even worse, and I wondered for the first time if I could really survive Pine Hollow, or if the forest would finally break through. The morning after the breach was different. I woke up feeling like I'd barely slept, my mind buzzing with fear and questions. The muddy footprints around the cabin were gone, swept away by my own shaking hands, but the memory of them lingered. I kept thinking about the new rule in the notebook. If something breaches the salt line, do not stay in the cabin. Grab the notebook and run to the river. Don't look back. I read it over and over, wondering just how close I'd come to disaster. I spent the day on edge, jumping at every sound. The forest was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that hides things. I kept expecting to see deer in the clearing, or hear that soft, pleading voice at the window. I checked the salt lines again and again, making sure they were thick and unbroken. By noon, I was pacing the porch, trying to calm my nerves, when I heard a truck rumbling up the old road. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, but then I saw the familiar shape of Tom's old pickup rolling into the clearing, dust rising behind it. Tom stepped out, looking older and more tired than when I'd last seen him. His beard was longer, his eyes even more haunted. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded, like he'd expected to find me this way, worn down, scared, but still standing. "Thought I'd check in," he said, his voice rough. "Heard some things on the radio. Figured you might need a hand." I let out a shaky breath. "I'm glad you're here, Tom. I think I'm in over my head." He nodded, stepping onto the porch. "You've been following the rules?" I nodded. "Every single one. But they keep changing. The forest, it's getting bolder." Tom looked out at the trees, his face grave. "That's how it works. The rules aren't just for you. They're for whatever's out there too." We sat on the porch, and I told him everything. The deer, the lights, the voices, the footprints, the breach. Tom listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the forest. When I finished, he sighed. "You're not the first ranger to go through this, Casey, and you won't be the last. This place, it's old. Older than the park, older than the trees. There are things here that don't belong anywhere else." He paused, choosing his words carefully. The rules were written by the first rangers who survived. They learned the hard way what to do and what not to do. Every time the forest finds a new trick, we add a new rule. It's the only way to keep the balance. I thought about the notebook, about the shaky handwriting that kept appearing. "Who writes the new rules, Tom? Is it you?" He shook his head. "Sometimes it's me. Sometimes it's someone else. Sometimes it just shows up, like the forest wants you to know, but only if you're paying attention." A cold shiver ran down my spine. So what happens if I break a rule, or if the forest finds a way around them? Tom looked at me, his eyes tired but steady. "Then you do what the last rule says. You run. You take the notebook and you get to the river. That's the only place the forest can't follow. Not all the way anyway. The water keeps it out for a while." I swallowed hard, thinking about how close I'd come to running the night before. "And if I make it to the river?" He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then you wait for sunrise. If you're lucky, the forest lets you go. If not," he trailed off, looking away. "Well, not everyone makes it." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind in the trees. Finally, Tom stood up. "You've done better than most, Casey, but you need to decide. You can stay, keep following the rules, and hope the forest doesn't find a way in. Or you can leave, walk away before it's too late." I shook my head. "If I leave, who writes the next rule? Who warns the next ranger?" Tom looked at me, his eyes sad. "That's the choice. Someone always has to stay. Someone always has to watch. He put a hand on my shoulder. If you decide to leave, do it before the next full moon. That's when the forest is strongest. If you stay, be ready. The rules will change again. He turned to go, but paused at the edge of the porch. One more thing. If you ever see your own reflection outside at night, don't follow it, no matter what. With that, he got in his truck and drove away, leaving me alone with the forest and the rules. I sat on the porch until the sun went down, thinking about what Tom had said. The choice weighed heavy on me. Stay and fight, or leave and hope someone else could survive. That night, I followed the rules more carefully than ever. I locked every door and window, checked the salt, and kept the notebook close. The forest was quiet, but I could feel it watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. As I sat by the window, I caught a glimpse of something moving outside. For a moment, I thought I saw my own face staring back at me from the darkness. I looked away, heart pounding, and wrote a new line in the notebook. If you see your own reflection outside at night, do not follow it. The rules were still changing. The forest was still testing me, and I knew, one way or another, my time as a ranger was coming to an end. The night after Tom's visit was the longest of my life. The forest felt alive and restless, as if it knew a decision was coming. Every sound seemed sharper, every shadow deeper. I moved through my routine with the notebook clutched tight in my hand, locking doors, checking salt, testing the porch light, repeating the rules in my head like a prayer. As midnight passed, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the trees groan. I sat by the stove, staring at the flames, trying to ignore the feeling that something was waiting just outside. I thought about Tom's words, about the choice every ranger had to make. Stay and keep the rules, or leave and hope someone else could survive. Sometime after 2 a.m., the radio crackled. I froze, remembering the rules about the voices. Static filled the room. Then a voice I didn't recognize whispered my name. I turned the radio off, heart pounding. The forest was testing me again, pushing at the edges of the rules, looking for a way in. Then, at 3:33 a.m., the porch light flickered and died. I grabbed a new bulb and my flashlight, stepping out onto the porch. The air was freezing, and the clearing was full of deer, more than I'd ever seen, their eyes glowing in the dark. They stood in a silent circle around the cabin, unmoving, watching. I forced myself to change the bulb, hands shaking. As the light snapped on, the deer blinked and melted back into the trees. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. But the forest wasn't finished. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps on the roof, slow, heavy, circling above me. I remembered the rule. If you hear footsteps on the roof, do not investigate. I stayed put, gripping the notebook, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then came the knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I didn't move. I didn't answer. The knocking grew louder, more urgent, then stopped as suddenly as it started. I sat in the darkness, waiting. The forest pressed in, whispering through the walls, trying to find a crack in the rules. I felt it in my bones, the sense that if I made one mistake, one wrong move, it would all be over. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, the pressure lifted. The forest fell silent. I stumbled outside, blinking in the pale morning sun. The clearing was empty. The deer were gone. The footprints in the salt had vanished. I sat on the porch, exhausted. The notebook felt heavier than ever in my hands. I flipped through the pages, reading the rules one by one. Each one was a memory, a warning, a line between survival and whatever waited in the trees. That afternoon, I packed my things. I walked the trails one last time, saying goodbye to the forest that had nearly claimed me. I left the notebook on the desk, open to the first page with a new line written in my own shaky hand. If you decide to leave, do it before the next full moon. Leave notebook for the next ranger. As I drove away, the forest watched me go. I felt its eyes on my back, felt the weight of the rules pressing in. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't answer the voices that whispered my name from the shadows. I made it to town just as the sun was setting. I called headquarters, told them I was done. They didn't ask questions. Maybe they already knew. Maybe they'd heard the stories, read the rules, seen the fear in the eyes of every ranger who'd come before me. Sometimes, late at night, I dream of Pine Hollow. I see the deer in the clearing, the lights in the trees, faces at the window. I hear the rules in my head over and over, like a heartbeat. And I wonder who's watching the forest now. I wonder if they're following the rules. I wonder if they'll survive. But most of all, I wonder if the forest will ever let any of us go.